What is work? That's really the question that we need to ask in order to get to the bottom of this. And here's a hint for you. Some of you are probably already aware of this. But it's how much you pay. You get paid for how much work you do. Most of you are familiar with the idea of work. We do a lot of it every day. So here's you. And here you with your big muscles. And those big muscles are what makes it possible for you to do work. Because with those muscles, you can apply forces to things. And when you apply a force to something, you can move it. And when you move it, that's how you do work. So here you are with your big muscles capable of doing work. You're standing on the ground, and there's a pile of bricks on the ground. And the boss brings up the pickup truck and says, load the bricks, truck. So you pick bricks and you load them into the truck. And anybody who's ever done this task before knows that this is work. At least it was when this is how I made my living back in the summer of 1970. Well, if you have a heavier brick, it takes more work to get that brick into the. Or if the truck bed is higher or farther away, it takes more work to get each brick into the truck. And of course, every brick is a little bit of work, and so the more bricks you have to load, the more work you end up doing. So the definition of work, the real definition of work, is that it's force times distance. You apply that force with your muscles, and you move something through a distance, and you do work. So the force in this particular case is coming from your muscles, and the distance is actually, it's the vertical distance that matters in this particular case. And those of you who are familiar with these ideas know that I'm being a little bit cavalier here, because there's some complications and technicalities that with regard to the efficiency with which muscles work. But keeping that aside, the amount of work that's actually done on the bricks is really just the vertical distance you move them through. The more force you apply, the more work you do. The farther you move something, the more work you do. The more bricks you move, the more work you do. Now, in English units, work, you can quantify work as in this unit of pound-feet. That's a force. A pound is a unit of force, and a foot is a unit of distance. So if you multiply pounds times feet, you get a unit of work.
So that's what that dash means, right? The pounds times feet. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying, and it's good that you brought that up, because there are two conventions for writing that product of pound and feet. One is with a little hyphen, it's not a minus sign, and one is with a dot. And I'm a little old-fashioned. I still use the dash. A lot of people use the dot, but the point is that you're multiplying pounds times feet. In metric units, you quantify work with a unit called the Newton, which is a unit of force, and a meter, which is a unit of distance. And some of you probably know what a Newton is, but just in case you don't, a Newton is about the weight of an ordinary apple. If you hold an apple in your hand, because the apple has weight, it makes a force of about 1 Newton on your hand, and you're also pushing on the apple with about 1 Newton. And a meter, most of you probably know, is about 39 inches. So a Newton meter of work is the amount of work it takes to pick an apple up off the floor and put it on the counter. 1 Newton of force times 1 meter of distance is a Newton meter of work. 1 Newton meter is called a joule. A Newton meter is kind of a clumsy unit, so we name it. We call it a joule. And just like we named that unit of force after the great Isaac Newton, who first gave us an understanding of force, the joule is named after James Prescott Joule, who gave us a lot of understanding of how work works. Now, I've done the math here. So if you think about loading 1 brick onto the back of the truck, a brick weighs about 1 kilogram, 2.5 pounds, 2.2 pounds, and if the truck is a meter off the ground and the acceleration of gravity is 10 meters per second squared, then it's about 10 joules of work to pick a brick off the ground and put it in the back of the truck. Just like it's about 1 joule of work to pick up an apple. The brick's 10 times as heavy as an apple. And so if you've got one guy, one man, and I don't mean to gender this, I'm using man in the sense of just a human being. A man can load 30 bricks in 1 minute. He's doing work at a rate of 30 bricks per minute. That's what you mean by 30 bricks every minute. So and there's 60 minutes in an hour. So if you let him go on for an hour, he's going to load 1,800 bricks per hour. Now, 10 joules per brick, that means his work rate is 30 bricks per minute times 10 joules per brick. If you look, you'll see those bricks cancel each other out, and you get 300 joules per minute. That's the rate at which you are doing work when you're loading bricks into that truck in metric units. You could call it bricks per minute if you want, but bricks aren't standard. Joules are. If you didn't follow all that math, don't worry. We're just going to need that number again in a minute. The point is that work you get by multiplying force times distance. If you take an object, you apply a force to it, that force causes it to move through some distance. You multiply the force times the distance, and you get the amount of work that you did. Now, it takes time to do work. Those bricks don't go into the back of the truck instantly. And the easier thing to measure is actually the rate at which you do work. Bricks per minute, or maybe joules per second. The rate of doing work is what we call power. So when you talk about power, you're really not talking about somebody's strength. You're not talking about how much force can be applied. You're talking about the rate at which work can be done. So power, since it's a rate, is the amount of work that you do in some period of time divided by the time required to do it. So here you are with your big muscles getting ready to do some work. And I say that you have the capacity to move 30 bricks per minute. That's we call it one manpower. It's the amount of power you're capable of exerting. That's the same as 300 joules per minute. If you take those 30 bricks moved per minute, multiply by 60, I'm sorry, 10 joules per brick, you get 300 joules per minute. So that's at which you're doing work. That's your power output. That's the same as 5 joules per second. If you divide that number of minutes by 60 seconds, you get 5 joules per second. That's the rate. That's your power output. That's the rate at which you're doing work. Not a lot of work, not a lot of power. That unit, the joule per second, the rate at which you're doing work, is called the watt. Just like the Newton is named after Isaac Newton and the Joule is named after James Prescott Joule, the watt is named after Isaac Watt, with the steam engine guy.
And that's really what we came here to talk about, isn't it, Yorke? That this notion that we keep thinking of these things as rates, and we have a rate, miles per hour, gallons per second, whatever it is. And then when we start talking about electricity, we're looking for a rate, and we reference that rate as a watt. We don't think of that as a fraction, or at least we don't express it as a fraction. And as a result, a lot of people get lost right at this moment. So I like it, you're making the point that a watt is equal to what? 1 joule per second. So in fact, it is a rate. It is a rate. And isn't that your point?
That is exactly right. A watt is a rate of doing work. It's the amount of work done in joules divided by the time required to do it in seconds. A watt is a joule per second. And that's really all there is to it. There's nothing complicated or mysterious or mystical about it. It's just rate at which you do work. And to understand what work is, and work is force times distance, then a watt is the rate at which you're moving things forcefully through distances. Okay, now, I don't think a watt is too hard to understand. What really confused people is what's a watt hour? All right, so what's a watt hour? Here's a hint. What's a man hour? A man hour is something that I think most people are familiar with. The idea is if you have one person who's capable of doing work, and you multiply that by the amount of time that he works, you're going to get the total amount of work that he did. So a man hour is the amount of work one man can do per hour times the number of hours that were worked. If you have a pile of bricks, one guy can move the pile of bricks in 10 hours. Put two guys on it, they can move it in 5 hours. Put four guys on it, they can move it in 2.5 hours. The people use the idea of the man hour to estimate total amount of work that's done or needs to be done all the time. And it's that same multiplication of the amount of work a man can do, a rate, times the time that he does it. It's the ordinary rate times time equals amount that you're familiar with. Miles per hour times hours is distance traveled. If you travel at 30 miles an hour and you go for 2 hours, you travel 60 miles. But in the case of doing work, do the rate in watts, joules per second, and the time in hours, you're going to get an amount of energy in watt hours. So watt hours is the amount of work done at the rate of 1 watt over the period of an hour. All right, now a watt was a joule per second. An hour is 3,600 seconds. So if you take 1 watt, that's 1 joule per second. 1 watt times 1 second is 1 joule of work. 1 watt times 3,600 seconds, an hour, is 3,600 joules of work. So there are 3,600 joules of work in a watt hour. A watt hour is just a measure of the total amount of work done by some power supply at some number of watts for some amount of time measured in hours. Okay? Now, work is what you pay for. You don't pay for power. I mean, there's a capital cost for building something that is capable of exerting power or using power or producing power, but work is what you pay for in the end. Your electric bill comes in kilowatt hours. You pay your workers for the amount of work they produce. Manpower costs about $15 a man hour. 1 man is a rate, $15 per hour paying for work done. That's about $2 per kilowatt hour. Electricity, on the other hand, is about 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So there's very interesting disparity of scales here. So anyway, that's what's up with watts.